Kevin. Thanks for coming. It looks really nice here. Maybe I'll have to get a job here. So let's start. On the way to the airport, I went to the local farmers market and bought one of my local favourites. And I'll give that to the person who Kevin says asked the best question. Okay. So I'm a jumped up lab weenie who programs. I worked in a hospital lab. Then I got picked up by a lab systems vendor that competes with Cerner. I accidentally ended up as CTO for the lab system vendor. This is in Australia. And spent more and more of my time doing interop, because that's what we do, right? And it seemed like 70 to 80% of our work was data exchange. And then it got me in contact with the community, and I was like, not like we were really happy with where we were with the specs, and so we decided that we'd commit a little bit to that, and I kind of enjoyed that. One thing led to another, and I ended up editing the version 2 chapters with the specification. And then the company I was working for decided it was time to re-engineer for the third time their whole product base. And I'm just not that interested. I'd much rather work with the community and do interop stuff. So I quit the company and went consulting. Still worked a bit for the company because they're nice guys, but it was much more fun working with the community. And then that's where we get to with FHIR. So let's talk about healthcare. So Kevin said, you guys all know what web APIs are. I'm not going to tell you about what FHIR is. I'm going to talk about what's around FHIR, why we're doing it, what we're trying to achieve. In my personal life, people that my family, my friends, my social network, we get sick and we encounter the healthcare system, and it's a disaster. Even when it's working well, it's a disaster. And I travel around the world talking to people, and one of the things I talk to people about is the healthcare system, and it doesn't matter where we are in the world, it doesn't matter how the system's funded, how it's run, it doesn't matter how the politics work, the system is a disaster. So I want to tell you about my dad. My dad said to me back in September last year, I think I might have cancer, prostate cancer. I'm like, yeah, well, he's the right age to get prostate cancer. So I've been talking to him about this. It took 5 months from when he called me and said that to when they actually gave him a diagnosis and started treatment. And it was, you need a scan, you need a referral to a specialist, you need another scan, you need some consultation, we're not sure what to do, we need to consult, and everything takes weeks. Every step, the transfers, you've got to get in the queue again from the start. And that's a really common story. And then he's talking to me, and different people are giving him different advice. And then I've got a friend who needs psych care, and she gets shuttled across the different parts of the system, and they're all giving her different advice about what treatment she should be having, what she should be prioritising, and she's like trying to judge between the different parts of the system. And those are all common stories. And then, well, we're not even going to talk about money. If we're going to talk about broken systems, it's too hard to talk about. But healthcare is full of broken processes, and it's just filled with people who do their utmost to do really good care, but the system works against them. Even when they think they're doing really good care, they're not really. And if you look around, other industries are being transformed. And there's some really big sweeping changes happening in other industries. IT enables process transformation, and yet that's not happening in healthcare. It's not just about IT, but until the IT works in healthcare, nothing else can change. Everybody's stuck going, we kind of feel as if we could do better, but we can't. And so IT is not the solution, but IT is a block to the solution. If you go back to 2011, just when we started working on FHIR, we had version 2 based messaging integration. I lived and breathed version 2 for a decade. We had version 3, which is this really ambitious RIM-based methodology, it was too ambitious. We had CDA, which was starting to work. It was an offshoot from V3. It was going okay. And that's built with XDS. You can build an enterprise document repository. And we built one in Australia, and we were midway through building one. And everybody was telling me how good it was and how it's going to transform healthcare. Like, you know, I've never seen a company run their business in a repository of Word documents. It's not going to transform medicine. And some of you may have heard of FHIR, which is a European-Australian open source effort to try and improve the way healthcare information is managed. And that's where we were in 2011. And if you looked at what was happening in other industries, you looked at what was happening in healthcare, going, it's a disaster. Those standards are just completely irrelevant to the kind of changes that you can see coming over the horizon with the whole transformation agenda. And those standards were useless. It's not that they don't do what they do, but what they do is just not relevant for the kind of what we want to have. Now, I want to tell you a story about the HL7 Poetry Channel. The HL7 is a really passionate, tightly connected community, and it was very much subject to groupthink at this point. We had our standards, we thoroughly believed in what we were doing, and the dissonance was growing, right? We couldn't contain the dissonance anymore, and a group of us struggled with the dissonance, and the way that our dissonance found its voice was we had a Skype poetry channel. There's about 10 of us on this channel, and you're only allowed to submit poetry to the channel, and it had to be whimsical and funny, and it had to be relevant to HL7. So we had limericks and haikus a lot, and we had some really good stuff going by. And then we had this one meeting in 2011 in May. The whole meeting was just really, really gloomy, and you could tell that it was troublesome. And the place where that was most obvious was the poetry channel. The poetry on the poetry channel was turning distinctly suicidal. And this beauty went past on the poetry channel. I liked it so much, I published it on my blog, which caused an absolute explosion because it was a take on the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, but the wreck of HL7. And it was all about HL7, you know, getting into the storm and just completely unable to respond, and down it goes. And of course that was a pretty big deal socially at this meeting. And I walked away from the meeting thinking, we're wrecked. It's time to do something different. and so HL7 needed a new direction. And then a few months after that, I fell out of contract. So I contracted to the Australian government as the interop specialist for all the programs. And you know, government contracting, they wanted me to keep going, but they hadn't have their ducks in a row paperwork, so I couldn't keep going. So I had 6 to 8 weeks where I had no income. And I could go off and run off after the work, but you know what it's like as a consultant. So I said, I'm going to take this 6 to 8 weeks and say, well, what we do if we just shoved everything off the desk and said, what would we actually want? If we just started afresh, what would we do? And I looked around and said, well, who's doing stuff, the interop, that actually people like? Because we certainly weren't. And that led me to RESTful APIs, web APIs. So I grabbed a really popular one, which was 37 Signals Basecamp API. It was the big thing back then. I grabbed a copy of that, and I made my own copy of it, and I started hacking on it to do lab reporting, because I'm a lab guy. So we did lab reporting. And then I brought it back to HL7 in September. And so I'm co-chair of the core committees. I'm kind of like one of the insiders. I really thought that I was going to get murdered and thrown out of the organisation and told to never come back because I was a heretic. And I would have said, right, fine, I don't want to be part of the organisation anymore, I'm gone. And instead, everybody loved it. Everybody was like, when can we have it? Can we have it now? When does this plane take off? And well, here I am. And it's totally transformed HL7. It's totally transformed healthcare IT. It's turned me into someone rather more prominent than I ever expected. It's been totally unexpected. So HL7 took my work and gave it the moniker FHIR, FHIR. which is fast, health, something or other, something or other, something or other. It doesn't matter what it means. It's just a gag for a name. And it's really good because it's really unique. And so if you use the FHIR, you'll find us, the community, immediately. And we did have a contest to see a long-range joke about what does FHIR really stand for. And there's one joke, an insider joke, that if you say it really carefully enough, it's HL7 version 4 instead of 3. And the other one my personal favourite is that FHIR stands for Fixing HL7's International Reputation. All right. So what is it? This is off the slide deck that I gave yesterday. It's a pretty common slide deck for me. FHIR's the web for healthcare. That's what we're aiming for. We used to be a bit careful about saying that. It sounded too big, but we're kind of at the point now where we can say that's what we're about, is the web for healthcare. It's an open community and it's an open standard. And that's a real strong duality, right? We're a community, a social media organisation, and the technical standard we produce is just the record of what we had left when we finished arguing about something. So as a community, our goal is to make it easier to exchange healthcare information cheaper. It's open participation. Anyone can participate, and we use web infrastructure and social media and so forth. And it's led by HL7, which means that we're deeply connected to the worldwide community. And it's really palpable because some random developer somewhere in the world contacts me and says, hey, I need to know something about how FHIR works. And it doesn't matter whether it's a domain question or a local question, I know someone. Increasingly, I know someone every question. And that's really deep connectivity that we have all the way through the healthcare system. As a standard, the standard describes how to exchange healthcare information. It's a public domain standard, a web API, and one really important thing about it is the content that we describe has deep continuity with existing standards. So version 2 information, FHIR, you can see the relationship. All right? And when you sit down and actually map the work over, yeah, look, there's stuff where we've updated stuff, we've made changes, but fundamentally it's the same basic ideas. And since the version 2 content model and the CDA content model have rippled all the way through the healthcare system, that continuity is a big deal. Now, creating a new standard it's not a low-risk occupation. First of all, creating a standard is like creating a startup. It's got a failure rate up around 80% or higher, right? I mean, first of all, you start a standards effort and then it turns out you just can't get enough impetus and energy to pass it, or then you get it passed and everybody who should implement it looks at it and goes, nah, and it just sits there. And one of the problems with standards is there's so many standards, you don't know which ones are actually being used. And then of course the people who passed it are totally committed to it, so they're busy faking up an active community around it. It's actually pretty hard to tell, but really they're like startups. And then the other problem is as beautifully shown in this XKCD standard, do you really need a new standard? And the key thing for us is we had spent a long time trying to fix the standards we had, but increasingly, once the standard exists and is going in a direction, it's like a huge ship with no rudder. You just can't change the direction. And you have to be really sure why you're doing it. And sure enough, we did add another standard, and right now in the market's starting to deal with the fact that we added another standard. And I get people coming to me all the time going, why do you do this? And here's the answer. Why did we do this? What makes FHIR worth it? And compared to the standards that we had, well, it's a web API. I don't need to talk about any more about that except to point out that the thing about a web API is the web API is capability based. We had grown up doing messaging. You and I have a business agreement and we exchange messages in agreement according to that business agreement. And then if that business agreement changes and we're going to change the functionality, then we go back to the drawing board and say, well, what's going to happen with the messages? With the web APIs, you just go, well, we'll just keep using the web API. It's a totally different way of thinking about how to create interoperability. And that alone makes a change worth it. Another thing that happens right now is you've got messaging, and you've got documents, and they're totally different content models. And someone's got to do the conversion. And what we said is, let's have the same content model, whatever you're doing. Okay, so you've got to do the conversion from the existing standards, but as you move into that sandbox, you get more and more consistency. We have an open license, that is a big deal. We have a consistent internal philosophy around pragmatism and making the standard something people want to use, instead of making the standard something that people go, do I really have to use this? We have an open community with public tooling and a public testing infrastructure, and we have, as I said, continuity with existing healthcare standards. Any one of those things might have justified FHIR, but that whole package is what makes it worth having a new standard. So when people come to me and say, well, why did you do this? Then that's the answer. It's that package that means that we have a standard that is an order of magnitude more useful than the ones that we had. And that's what makes it worth having the change. This cartoon here actually came out about halfway through the work, and everyone came to us and said, had you thought about this? Yeah, we thought about that. Okay, so the thing about the FHIR spec is there's so many different ways to use it. So you can write standalone FHIR server. I write one. It's kind of like the reference server, and it's all it is, a general purpose FHIR server that has a big store. More usefully, you could write a FHIR server in front of an existing application, voilà, what you guys do. And there's interface engines that speak FHIR. There's lots of tablet phone applications, web portals. We're starting to see healthcare applications that sort of pivot around FHIR as their inner and outer communication system. We've got Smart on FHIR, EHR plugin framework, CDS hooks, and that list is, I mean, that's just an indicative list. It's that number of ways you can use it that starts to become really useful. I want to talk a few minutes about our ethos. This is what I encourage all the team to have on the wall. Focus on getting it implementable. Focus on what people actually do. And in particular, be very focused on common scenarios. It's really easy to sit in committee and start talking about the challenges that we have, and suddenly we're talking about these really weird use cases. One of Michelle's co-chairs is my favourite. He's the lead allergist for the immunology board in here, and it's almost immediate if you start talking about allergies. You'll start talking about these really weird use cases that only happen like once a year. And like, just focus on the common stuff, because that's the bulk of what we deal with. And if you get distracted into the corners, it gets pretty difficult. Where possible, we use the web technologies. We encourage everyone to put human-readable XHTML in all the resources. It just is like a line in the sand that you can't fall below for clinical safety and ease of use. We want to make our content freely available, and we want the content, the patient's content, to be freely available. Okay, it's got to be secure, but we want it to be easy, if not free. And we want to support multiple paradigms. And what that means is, yes, there's a web API. Everybody loves the web API. Great. We love the web API too. But we have lots of implementation projects where they go, you know what? The web API doesn't work for us, but we love FHIR. We say, fine. There's other ways to exchange information. You can package it up and store it in documents. You can do the old V2 messaging thing. You can mix and match those things with SOAs. And that idea of supporting multiple paradigms is a big part of what makes FHIR okay across the whole system. Everybody goes, yeah, we could make that work. And one key thing here is the idea that we should be simple. And simple is a really challenging thing in healthcare, because there's so much variability and so much inherent complexity. And so what we want to be as simple as appropriate. My rule here is that you can make complexity worse, but you can't make it better. You can't make it go away. If the problem is inherently complex, it will be complex. And if the solution isn't as complex as the problem, where did the complexity go? One great thing people do is they describe a real simple interface that works for their problem. They've externalized the complexity to somebody else. Somebody else is going to pay the price. So what I'm always searching for is the sweet spot. Enough complexity to be useful, but not so much complexity that no one can deal with it. And there's no easy way to pick the sweet spot. How simple we can be is limited by complexity, by baked-in jurisdictional regulations and laws and cultural variations, and by clinical independence. And increasingly we're getting to the point where the rate limiting step is clinical agreement. People are understanding they have to actually have consistent record-keeping practices if they're going to have consistent processes. And a lot of clinicians, it's not in their thinking. And how simple is appropriate depends on what you're doing. I mean, we don't all use Notepad, right? We don't all use text editors because there's more complexity in the world than that. So FHIR is fundamentally a discovery process to find out where the sweet spot might be. And we'll accept any sweet spot that looks like a sweet spot, actually. But in the end, that's driven by participation, which is why FHIR is first a community. There's no simple answer here. We've got an answer that drives people to go, we can work with this. And that's all I ever hoped for. And the fact that we have something that everybody says we can work with, it's almost a miracle. That's what drives the popularity. But it's not a silver bullet. So some of you might have seen this Gartner technology adoption curve. So the idea is that technology is defined and marketed on the bottom left here, and it's a trigger. It becomes available. And immediately the market goes nuts and gets really, really excited about the technology, and they get all excited about what can happen, and it's called the peak of inflated expectations. And then it turns out that the promises and the hype were not justified, and people get all disillusioned and go, it's not going to solve our problems after all. And then eventually a maturity forms around the technology, and the technology starts to be used for what it's good for, and you enter a plateau of productivity. You know, my favourite example of this in work is a guy from Gartner showed me a newspaper clipping from the 1970s explaining how that SQL was really good because it meant that every checkout chick could run an SQL statement at the end of the day assessing her own performance. No, not going to happen that. So people often show me this diagram and say, well, where's FHIR in this? Where are you? And of course, the great thing about this diagram is you only know where you were in retrospect. So I can say whatever I like. But I kind of feel as though finally the hype is starting to, the gradient of the hype is starting to fall, which means that we might be starting to approach the peak. It's not up to us whether there's a trough or not. It's what I've always said to the FHIR team is there will be a trough. Our goal is to make the fundamentals as solid as we can so that the trough is as shallow as we can make it. Right? If the fundamentals are in place, we can't control hype, although if you look at me on Twitter, about half the time via Twitter, I'm actually trying to damp things down, right? There's no silver bullet to healthcare. So where are the pain points? So first of all, FHIR doesn't resolve lots of content disagreements. We don't have the authority to do that. So this is a big bone of contention at HL7. A bunch of clinicians in particular come to HL7 and say, we're here to standardise the health record. And we say, no, we're not. We're providing a framework by which people can exchange healthcare information. That's a very fundamental tension in HL7. And we're really sure about this. If we turn around and said, here is the correct and only clinical record about one institution, the one that won the argument, would go, great, all our problems are solved. And everyone else would go, well, we're not using that. And so, but where we can encourage people towards consistency, we will, right? So it's a social process, a discovery process. But in spite of that, we can't tell people what to do for their record keeping. We don't have the authority to tell them. We have the authority to create a roller coaster towards a point, but everybody has to ride that. So that's one pain point that FHIR won't resolve, can't resolve. maybe in 10 or 15 years' time, what happened with patient demographics. When I first started doing version 2, people were all over the place with patient demographics, but over a 15-year period, we all sort of iterated towards relative consistency. So maybe that'll happen in 15 years' time. Someone will look at FHIR and go, stupid, you could do much better than that, let's do that. Maybe that'll happen. What we do have, pain points, we have problems with multiple versions, and that's something I've heard about this week. We are rolling forward with multiple versions. We fix things that are broken, and we always said we would do that until we were sure that we knew what we were doing. So our goal is that at the end of next year, we'll publish a normative version where the framework is solid, but all the other stuff we're still in motion trying to find out what's the best solution. Another pain point that we have is what's in scope and what's not. What is it the FHIR doesn't do? And sometimes I think the answer to that is nothing. There's nothing that we won't take on. We've managed so far to successfully say no to having a user resource. But we keep having to say no to having a user resource. Right? We're going to have to say it again soon, or we might have to say yes, but we'll see. But what is it we don't do? And we haven't found that out yet. So that's a pain point for us and potentially for everybody else. And then I just face adoption challenges around the world. Every country is in a different place, pushing back against change. Why do we have to change? Risk-averse organisations, which are also benefit-averse organisations, don't want to get involved because they like things how they are. So let's talk about that. So first of all, where are we going? I said we're going to have our first normative version at the end of 2018. Yep. And that's so the core infrastructure will be stable and we won't make breaking changes to it anymore. But in spite of that, even only a fraction of the core clinical data set will be normative. So we're still in progress. It's just really hard to get everybody to focus and agree on a common content model. We're seeing more and more functionality spreading wide. So we're about to start adding, and I'm a bit afraid of this, but we're about to start adding medication registration regulation content to the specification. Totally nothing to do with EHRs, but totally everything to do with medication recommendations, medication management packages, and government registration processes. So that's just one example of the spread of what we're doing. We're getting more and more support for a wider ecosystem. So CDS hooks is a great example, being led by Kevin. Those additional layered functionality, we're getting more of them, and we're starting to gradually influence the market. And that's that. Now we're getting to where we wanted to go in the first place. So let's talk about the market. The thing about FHIR is it's cheaper. We stand on the shoulder of giants, our own past work, the web ecosystem, a whole bunch of open source contributors, companies like Cerner and others. The skills and libraries that we make available are easily available, and everything we do is free, and our community is highly active. We have lots of open source tools. And all that means is that it's cheaper to get the same outcome. My goal was 90% cheaper. So when I got involved with PHRs, and the total cost of ownership of hooking up an institution to a PHR was around about $120,000, $130,000. Legal fees, project management, maintenance, development, upgrades. That was what we were pricing it at, right? I mean, it varies a lot, but that was a ballpark price, $120,000, $130,000. I wanted to drive that down to 10 total. We haven't done it yet, but that's what my goal is, commoditize it. And if that happens, you're driving down the cost, that kind of order of magnitude, or maybe more if I'd like to do more, everything becomes easier. What was expensive becomes affordable. What was impossible becomes, well, some things that were impossible become feasible. Things we couldn't do, we can do. What that means is more bang for your buck. If you're an institution, someone who spends money on integration, you spend less, you get more. What will that mean in terms of how much you spend? You'll spend more because you get more bang for the dollars you spend. So it's worth spending more, not less. A lot of people were really afraid of FHIR because we were going to destroy the market for interop. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. the better we get, the more money you'll get, because more integration becomes worthwhile. I've got a formula, by the way, for how much you need to spend on integration as an institution. It's n times 2, where n is the amount of money you can afford to. So that's where we're driving, is commoditisation. And then the other thing that we're driving is breaching the walled gardens. So you guys know a bit about this model, a walled garden model. Is you sell a server and all the stuff around the server, and the institution buys into it as a whole, and that's kind of the whole thing that they get. And our goal has been to breach those walls, to make it easy to mix and match stuff. What that means is you get more functionality for the same cost as a provider of healthcare, which means you can spend more on your IT, not less, but you get much more for it. So it will mean that you'll get more open source competition on the market. And what that does is just eats away at the weak ones and destroys the weak. Open source applications will always be the worst things on the market. You know that, right? Because they're free. So you can't possibly sell something worse, but you can sell something better. So open source applications are always the worst thing you can get. No, there's like a tail over, right, where you're selling something entirely useless, and open source is way better, but you've got a grace period where you can still make a little bit of money out of it. But in principle, open source is the floor below which the market doesn't go. But good vendors that sell product that's worthwhile, it's worth money, don't have anything to be afraid of there. So let's talk about healthcare itself now. It's my view, okay, I'm totally biased here, right, because it's my baby. It's not my baby anymore, though. When I started, it was me. But then we just gradually grew the team. And how big is the team now in FHIR? And it's a hard question, because what's the team? In a really open community, there's no boundaries. There's no list of contributors. There's in the spec, there's a list of people who have contributed directly, where you can trace their input directly. And that list is over 200 individuals now. Or maybe I need to count the number of people who work full-time on FHIR, the ones I know about, and I'm sure there's plenty in the room I don't know about, but there's over 1,500 people now working full-time on FHIR and contributing one way or another. The editors, there's 30, 40 editors. There's lots of people contributing open source tooling and content. It's a huge team, a huge community. This is not me anymore. In fact, I feel bad because, I come and do talks like this, but it's the community that builds this. It's not me. But in spite of that, I think that FHIR is our best shot at an interop specification for healthcare. You can criticise individual decisions we've made, and hey, everybody does. That's what we're here for. But overall shape, I don't know how we could get something better until somebody can get everybody who makes decisions in healthcare, put them all into one football stadium, seal the doors and say you can come out when you agree. In the absence of that, what else can we do? So improvement's an ongoing process, but anything that you could imagine as better needs wider changes to healthcare. And honestly, your government's made a whole lot of noise this year about proving precisely how hard it is to make any change to healthcare at all. And we're not really going to expect any driven change to the wider culture of healthcare unless we do it ourselves. And as yet, FHIR hasn't made any significant changes to healthcare. We've started to make real changes to healthcare IT. We haven't yet made any real changes to health. That's what it's all about from the beginning. I didn't do this for anything but to get my family and my social network better healthcare, and I'm going to keep doing what we're doing until that happens. And what we've seen, initially we were focused on our own methodology and just establishing that we could do anything, and we started being focused on evangelizing to the standards community, the HL7 community, and then we started evangelizing to the middleware community, and then to the EHR vendors, and then to the CIOs at the institutions. So you see that our influence is gradually expanding, We haven't yet made any change to healthcare. And the kind of ways that we think as a community need to change and adapt as our focus broadens. The kind of people that we seek to bring into the community to engage with are a different kind of people. We've got enough standards weenies now. Well, we've got one, it's probably enough. What we need is other kinds of engagement to build change in the healthcare community. Of course, IT is not, as I said before, we're a blocker to a solution, but we're not a solution. If you're going to actually fix healthcare, somehow you've got to fix the perverse financial incentives. I work with lots and lots of countries around the world with lots and lots of financial models. I think I said this before. We'll have the same problems because no matter how you construct the financial incentives, they're still perverse. So that's a problem. Legal and liability changes freeze the system as they are. Everyone's too afraid to change. We won't have a broken system, but it could be broken worse when we're finished. So we're afraid of that. We need to change the way being a doctor is conceptualised. They're conceptualised as someone who's totally independently accountable only to their patient and not to the system. And there's some real strengths to that model, but it really means it's really hard to get a system to behave right when there's all these mavericks in the system going, it's not about the system, it's about me. But to transform that to being about the system, that's a really hard transformation to make because the system could be worse. So that's a hard change. Then we need to get people to understand that the existing social contract around healthcare is part of the problem and to actually get the patients to change their behaviour. And there's a lot of focus on patients changing their behaviour in certain respects right now, but not in other respects about understanding what healthcare does and who provides it and how they provide it. And then there's a whole set of changes, to quote a relatively well-known patient advocate in here, give me my damn data. And I guess that sort of revolves around us, but it's not enough. So you as a patient, my parents-in-law get their patient, they get a big stack of paperwork. So what? The only possible use it has at the moment in practice is to take it to a lawyer. Don't do anything else. Okay, there's a few special cases. But the special cases I've heard, it's actually where, in effect, the patient has a carer who's actually caring for the patient. And they're actually part of the process. And they're locked off from the process. The carer, the mother or the daughter or the son, is locked off from the caring process. And getting them the information gets them into the process. That's all the cases where I've seen getting the patient their own data makes a real difference. It's when there's an actual carer who needs to know what's going on. What will make a difference is if you actually reform the healthcare process so the process is patient-centric. That's what will make a difference to people. But it's really hard to do that kind of transform given the amount of inertia and change control there is in clinical practice. And in particular, everywhere in the world we're rife with regulatory capture. And the professional associations own the process. So it's going to be hard. But our goal is to tilt the playing field more and more to the right kind of behaviour by making it easy to interoperate with the data so the data can support process change. So we enable deep and wide integration in a way that we haven't seen before. It's not a panacea, but hopefully it's a step to enable panacea. So we enable new kinds of clinical interoperability. I want to talk about clinical interoperability. The interoperability definition that HL7 has used classically is the ability of two or more systems or components to exchange information and to use the information that has been exchanged. We're saying now that's an entirely useless definition. What does use mean? I printed it out on a piece of paper. That was using it. A useful definition, which we're trying to encourage people to think about and think about the ramifications of this, is that a useful definition of interoperability is the ability of two or more clinical teams to exchange patients and provide seamless care. Actually, I had one clinician who looked at this and said, that's crap. The definition should be the ability of a clinician to move between teams and act in a seamless fashion. Is that a good definition? How do you think about that one? So we need to redefine what we're doing and stop talking about interoperability as an engineering artifact and start talking about interoperability as a business artifact, as a clinical artifact. And build deep clinical integration and build seamless processes. Seamless care across institutions and home, integrated care processes and scheduling, a good home medication management system. We have bits of that in some countries, but we need a good one that's ubiquitous everywhere. We need to make telemedicine ubiquitous. If you go and listen to people talk about telemedicine, they talk about the healthcare system and telemedicine. But we need to make remote consultation seamless throughout the process. So you don't have to wait 3 weeks for the right process, right? Remote consultation should be, virtual consultation should be everywhere, not just a separate thing. But most people still see it as a separate thing. Not everybody. And in the end, what I want is a patient-centred healthcare process, but one that's also a provider-centred healthcare, where provider means the people providing the healthcare, not the institutions. And in effect, this is a call to arms as against institutions, not against the people in them. Right? Healthcare will always require people. Healthcare will always require motivated people who really believe in health. But it might not require the same kind of institutions that we have, and that's the battle that's coming, is that the institutions will find the IT world underneath them chipping away at the way they function and pushing them towards a different kind of function. And there'll be players all through the system at all levels going, that's the kind of change we want to see, because we want healthcare where we're interested in the patients and the outcomes, not the institutions. That's what FHIR is about in the end, but it's a big plan and we're getting there. Okay, so thank you for listening and I'll take questions. Hey, Michelle.
So it's very easy to see how FHIR applies in the EHR setting. Can you speak a little bit more about the population health platform and how FHIR fits into that, specifically when you're thinking through longitudinal persons that were comprised of data from multiple sources, financial and clinical, and if there are any gaps in the spec or weaknesses or immature resources, can you elaborate on what those gaps might be in?
So the first thing you need to do is aggregate the data. Get the data, and that's been our main focus, is giving you the tools so you can get and aggregate the data that you need. Then you need to be able to analyse the data, and we've historically said it's nothing to do with us. But as I said, our focus is changing and broadening, and so in a couple of weeks' time I'm actually going to an R unconference with the maintainers of the R stats programming language, and what we're going to do is hook up or try and write a package so that R can address FHIR content natively, and see what that means and what we'd have to do to make that a meaningful thing to say. And so I'm really looking forward to that, and I don't think that'll happen in a 2-day thing, but it'll create a process. And so that's us getting interested in the analysis problem. It's not the only solution to the analysis problem, but it's us dipping our toe in the water of saying analysis is a thing that we care about. And in fact, we've also talked about a standardized Hadoop schema for FHIR so that you could share Hadoop queries and Hadoop analysis tooling across multiple databases. That's another, we haven't done it, we haven't got enough people interested in it, but it's another expression of our interest in the analysis problem. But, you know, it's just that interest. And then there's the question of reporting aggregate outcomes, and there's a lot of interest from reporting aggregate outcomes from the developing world. And in fact, most of the interest in FHIR is around aggregate outcomes, and so we're working with some of the UN and WHO programs to build aggregate reporting content, and we've got a long way to go there, and I think that's also relevant. And in fact, that's the most obvious thing that we don't have, and other than that, the things I don't know about that we don't have, I don't know.
So you talked a little bit about the difficulties and pressures between all the different things, whether it be the finances or any of that. So what's the biggest pushback that you've gotten, whether it be from institutions, whether it be from EHR providers?
And so the biggest pushback that I've had so far has been from large programs who are change averse. As I said before, that also means they're outcome averse, but they're process focused. And they're like, we don't want to change standards. We're not interested in all the outcomes you talked about. It's getting hard and embarrassing for them to say that in public now. And so that's kind of going away, right? All the national programs, all of the big cross-vendor groups have accepted that package of benefits that I talked about is compelling. But now we're starting to move into a new area where people are starting to say, for instance, pushback. When we first discussed doing the Argonaut project and getting all the vendors, the EHR vendors, to do a common vendor EHR API, patient API, there was a lot of skepticism that the vendors would do that. Skepticism you guys would do that. And of course you showed them and did that. Good. And now the ball's in the institution's court, and guess what? Nothing's happening. In fact, they're pushing back against the whole idea of an API. It's not really what they want to do. And so now suddenly they're discovering that it wasn't really about the vendors after all, it was really about them. And it's going to be really interesting to watch that perception play out in the market. I still have people this week telling me that the vendors don't want to share data. Although I've also had more people this week tell me, you know what, I'm starting to notice that they want to share data. Oh, duh! But now we have the same conversation about the institutions themselves. And so there's a big pushback around what it means with institutions to share data. So I work with something like the Karen Health Alliance, where there's a bunch of particular individuals who've got their hands on particular institutions saying we want to share patient data, have a single patient record that we all maintain. And then the other institutions are like, I don't think so. And so there's going to be a big bunch of pushback around that. You know, like what does it mean to start reorganising institutions? And that, I think that's where the game is now. The other thing I really want to see happen is I want to see us get to the point where a patient has a medication repository and all of us feed all the information we have to that patient repository so that they can run a program on their phone or their home computer or whatever that knows what medications they should be taking, knows what their stock in the drawer is, knows what they should be taking right now, and lets them report if they didn't comply and why. And I'd like to get to that point. But when I talk to authorities around the world, either they're like, oh, there's no way, or no, we're doing it ourselves, we don't need any help. So it's still always a chronic problem to get people to agree that their problems are the same problem and it's better to work together. So the thing is that when you start working together, you go slower initially. And then the payoff comes sometimes. But sometimes you fall apart and you're further behind than when you started. So that's the challenge for people, is to get with that process.
In that world you're describing, where does like consent, privacy fit into that world?
That's a really interesting question. In principle, I firmly believe in privacy and consent. In practice, I'm getting increasingly sceptical that there is such a thing as privacy at all. And that's kind of like, and not agreeing with that is starting to become like not agreeing with gravity. We might all like there to be no gravity, but there is. And I don't know how that's going to play out in a world where everybody can surveil everybody. I don't know what that means for privacy. For consent, my personal view is that healthcare is always kidding itself with consent. If I go to the hospital in Australia, I have to consent to share information. That's a kind of a funny use of the word consent, where the alternative is not to be treated. All right? It's more like blackmail. But nevertheless, we call it consent and collect it and have it. And so I don't know how that's going to play out either. But we have worked really hard in the spec to be able to share privacy and consent agreements and privileges and statements across the system. So we're working on that in spite of, like, put my personal skepticism aside. It's not that I don't agree with the goals. It's just IT tilts us against that. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but we're working as hard as we can to put the tools in place so that people can find out what the answers should be. Okay.